Alright, so today I want to quickly talk about Q factor. Now this video is more oriented towards those of you who are newer to tuning, but yeah, today I want to discuss what is Q factor and why it's important and what kind of things you should be consider when you're tuning your system. So to start off, your Q factor controls the narrowness or wideness of your EQ band. So we make it really high, it goes really narrow, and we make it really low, it goes wider. Okay, so a Q of 4.3 on most DSPs, if it has a constant Q, well, a Q of 4.3 is consistent with 1/6 octave smoothing. So, for instance, in Helix, we have all of these sliders, and they're each in the kind of fine EQ mode by default 1/6 octave away, and so that makes it really convenient, especially if you're using 1/6 octave smoothing on your frequency response measurements, to just come in here and you just do whatever you need to quickly make your EQ adjustments. Okay, so now why do I think you should stay away from high Qs? So there's two things to note. One is that you might not be fixing what you think you're fixing, and the second thing is that it distorts the phase around the frequency of interest. So whenever you are tuning and you are aiming for a really perfectly smooth house curve and you get everything within 1 decibel and you use these really sharp Qs, and then you come back the next time you tune and you measure it again just like how you thought you measured it, and then you're like, what the heck? This looks completely different. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in our acoustic measurements, and we need a lot of smoothing and different points in space to average them out and kind of get them to resemble what we hear. And so if you have a limited measuring technique, or even with multi-microarrays, and a really sharp peak that you're correcting might not actually be there, or it's there, but you move over a little bit, just a centimeter to the left or the centimeter to the right, and it's now a dip. And so you have to be really careful when you're using these high Qs to make sure that you are respecting the kind of small and limited listening area and not only correcting a local problem at a very specific point in space. Now, there are use cases for very high Qs, like taking out very specific resonances, but overall, there's a good chance that it'll cause you more problems than it will good. Hello, Will from the future here. Quick interjection. So the Q factor is less important at lower frequencies. So you're more likely to be able to get away with a very high Q the lower down the frequency spectrum you go, and that's a consequence of the wave size at lower frequencies. So at higher frequencies, you're much more likely to have very localized effects that when you move your head a little bit, you go from a cancellation to a dip. But at low frequencies, when the wavelengths are a lot longer, your measurements will be a lot more consistent across different points in space, and so will what you hear. And so with that, you can get away with using sharper equalization filters at lower frequencies, and it's really at higher frequencies where you have to be a lot more careful. Anyway, back to my rambling. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the sharper the Q, the sharper the phase shift around that Q. So we can see that this little dotted line with this shows the phase and how the EQ filters are altering the phase. And you can't avoid in infinite impulse response systems, you can't avoid when you make a magnitude change, it causing a change in the phase. And why is that? Well, that's because your your equalization filters need to store information about the signal to discern the frequency. So your higher frequency signal pieces will go through the filter a lot quicker than your lower frequency pieces. But the filter only sees one measurement at a point in time. So it has to collect data over time to figure out, is this part of a high frequency band or is this part of a lower frequency band? And so with that, because it has to measure chunks of the signal over time for it to discern between the frequency components, if you want to amplify some frequency components or remove some frequency components, well, then you have to alter the phase, because the phase is just the timing of that frequency component. So why is this problematic? Well, if your left and right measure the exact same, it's not as problematic, because the phase, the equalization will be the same, and the phase changes will be the same, and it doesn't really matter, truthfully. But if your left looks a lot different than your right, like let's say it's the exact opposite of this, and it looks like this, well then now your phase change will also look a lot different. And that discrepancy in the phase between the left and the right speakers can cause issues with your center coherency. So just because they match perfectly left to right magnitude-wise, if they're not in phase across the frequency spectrum, well then they're not going to sound as clear and as pinpoint. So with that, I like to use lower Qs at all times if I can. So we have these really jagged phase lines, but if we smooth out the Q, we can see that they just look a lot more reasonable. Now, 1/6 octave is consistent with the 4.3, like I was saying. And 1/3 octave is consistent with 2.3. And 1 octave is consistent with 0.7. So what I like to do is I like to start, let's just reset. So I like to start with taking my measurements and 1 octave smoothing. And then I go into parametric EQ, and this, excuse me, sir, you are not parametric. There we go. And I like to start with making really large changes and get the big picture in, okay, the background of your painting. And then after I get 1/3 or 1 octave looking good, then I go into 1/3 octave. I get a little more detail. And then when I do my EQs, well then I'm looking at doing changes in 2.3. So then I do this, add a little bit more detail. I do 2.3, and this is all hypothetical, but okay. And then lastly, I go into 1/6 for all the last final details. So then I'd go in here, and then I'd go keep that 4.3, and then make the last changes that I need in 1/6 octave to make it looking really good. Now I avoid 1/6 octave smoothing when I can. That might be, depending on you ask, you'll get different answers around that. But I tend to like staying in the 1/3 octave range because I tend to find the tunes a bit more musical. Now you can get really technically accurate, sound with higher than 1/3. and it might stage an image really well, but if you go too crazy with being precise with your filters, then it can sound a bit clinical, it can sound a bit dry. In fact, I mean, that's what happened to me at my very first competition. I came in there, I hadn't really listened to a lot of other cars, so I'd only really listened to mine, and that's the standard I knew. And I thought I was going to do so good because my, staging was really good, and I had gotten everything to the target curve within half a dB, and I was like, "This is going to be great. I'm going to kill it." And I got, I got last in my first competition because it wasn't, the frequency balance wasn't there. It was just, and it didn't have any life to it. It was really dry. I remember my judge told me, "This is a great foundation, and your staging is surprisingly accurate, but it just it has no enjoyment, it has no life, and the actual tonal accuracy of it is not natural." And in looking back, I totally agree. So now I find myself going to lower and lower EQ. So yeah, to sum up, you don't want to go really any higher, especially if you're a beginner, than a Q factor of 4.3. That's consistent with 1/6 octave smoothing. And so if that's what you're tuning with, then there's really no need to go higher than that. And just keep in mind that if you're being really anal about getting it perfect, there's a good chance that the next time you come in, it won't look anything like that, because there's a lot of uncertainty in our measurements. And just to reiterate, especially, if you're new, I would suggest starting in 1 octave, doing the big changes, then moving up to 1/3, and then going to 1/6 as needed. But really, I mean, the 1/3 land, I think that's where it's at personally. But I've also tuned in 1/6 and even higher. I've tuned in 1/48, and it didn't work out too well, but experiment. But yeah, don't be afraid to go too low, and don't be too anal about getting your measurements exactly to the target curve. Anyway, that's all. I hope you learned something, and I'm listening to all the feedback that y'all left. So I want to get a real smart tuning video in, and get some demos and some more content. So if you have any ideas or for what you want me to cover, feel free to leave in the comments. I'm listening and I'm there. So thank you very much.